You're listening to Higher Ground with me, John Graff. I'm a partner in the higher ed and litigation practices at Hirsch Weinstein in Boston, Massachusetts. With me today, as always, my good friend and colleague, Scott Schneider from Austin, Texas, and Aaron Larson, our marketing and communications wizard here at HRW. Good morning, Scott.
Johnny, how are you doing, my friend?
Couldn't be better. Couldn't be better.
You look like you're in the dark right now, man. Is this a metaphor or something?
No. It's sort of an amateur attempt to try to get the lighting conditions right with the external camera that I'm using, and obviously I have failed miserably.
I like it, dude.
So it's great to see you, man.
Likewise.
Super excited for our discussion today. So let me just give a little context for what we're about to get into. At least of today, Wednesday, Veterans Day, by the way. And, thanks to all of the veterans who have served and all the folks who continue to serve our country in the military. November 11, it appears that Joe Biden has been elected to the presidency of the United States with his running mate, Kamala Harris, heading with him to serve as his vice president, at least as of today. We'll see what happens in January, of course. Confirmation obviously yet to be had here, but it appears that this is a done deal after a very contentious 2020 campaign season and election. So what's happening right now in the political landscape and in the federal government as a result of this election impacts higher ed in big ways, but not all of them are so obvious. I'm looking at a couple of articles in the Chronicle this morning. We love to give a shout out to the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Specifically, I've got Jack Stripling's November 6th article, Trump's presidency may be over, Trumpism is not. And that article discusses academics struggling with what that means, even in the absence of a Trump presidency. We've got Michael Vasquez, November 7, 2020, his article, Joe Biden won, here's what higher ed can expect. That's an excellent read. I suggest everybody have a look at that. And he's talking there about tuition-free college, student debt relief. I wish I had gone to school for free, by the way. And the reversal of some Trump-era policies that we might wind up talking about. And then, of course, Scott, our buddy Eric Kelderman, his October 30 article, The College Degree is Dividing America. And I know you guys are tight friends, you and Eric.
Yeah.
Make no mistake, higher ed world, that from an operations and risk management standpoint, from a political and strategic growth perspective, higher ed should be very interested in the outcome of this election and what happens over the next year or two, not just for the optics, but because the election is going to impact how we operate as an industry. So, to our guest to help us figure this all out, John Ashford is the chairman and chief executive officer of international public affairs and public relations firm, the Hawthorn Group in Alexandria, Virginia. John's got quite an interesting background and will add some very interesting perspective and insight to this. He began his work in politics in Missouri, where he was born and raised. And by the time he was only 26 years of age, the Kansas City Star newspaper had referred to him as a political kingmaker. I would love to be a kingmaker at any age in my life. The fact that you did it at 26 is all the more amazing. John worked as a staffer on Capitol Hill for members of the House and Senate. He spent 10 years working with a legendary political consultant and strategist, Matt Reese. John works extensively with the energy, electric utility, healthcare, consumer products, and higher ed industries. I'm going to pause for personal note here. I have worked extensively with John Ashford and his colleagues at the Hawthorn Group. He's become a very good friend of mine throughout the course of our work together. He and his business partner, Larry Walsh, are mentors of mine in the world of public affairs and public relations strategy and deployment. And so this is one of truly a moment where my life work gets to intersect with or I should say my career gets to intersect with my own personal development. So this is kind of a personal thing for me to be able to welcome John Ashford to our podcast to help us dissect what the election of Joe Biden means to higher ed. John, welcome to Higher Ground, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be with you, as it's always a pleasure to work with you.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate your insight.
John he lost a little bit of credibility with me there when he says it's always a pleasure to work with you. I mean,
Well, with those things that are not a pleasure with John, I assign to my partner, Larry Walsh.
Yeah, and you all can see why this is such a great team already. John, let me kick off the Q&A here. On Saturday, November 7th, I think the media called the presidential election for Joe Biden, and of course, Biden declared victory. What are you hearing and sensing about Biden's priorities for higher ed right now?
Well, of course, everything is consumed under the banner of COVID. And frankly, actually, let me back up. No, first, everything is under the banner of resolving the election. When will Trump concede, if ever? When will the transition get underway? What are going to be the roadblocks? Then, of course, Biden's first priority is COVID, which, will have enormous effect on higher education in terms of campuses and their students and their employees and the distribution of vaccine. But thinking about Biden's priorities for higher ed, which, we're not hearing much about as the media is otherwise consumed, as I said, you've got his historical interest in higher education, which is not terribly notable, but a 40-year record. Probably the most important thing to keep in mind about Joe Biden is his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, is an active university professor and has announced she plans to continue her teaching career as First Lady. He's under enormous pressure from the progressive left, has already addressed aspects of free tuition, community colleges, families making under $125,000, and some form of debt relief for student loans. All of that is going to be front and center with him.
What if you're able to even predict at this point, between the first 6 months and 12 months out into his presidency, what do you see sort of being his first, second, third knockdown targets with respect to education?
Well, whatever his first target with respect to education is, will be lucky to rise to his 7th, 8th, 9th target overall. As I said, COVID is going to be everything. Climate change, repairing international relations, and under COVID is not only addressing the health issues, but the economic issues, the kids homeschooling. You may have had some experience with that, John.
Oh, yes.
I think the first thing that will affect education is whatever the next stimulus bill is. Will it have bailouts for institutions? Will it have bailouts for students and their families and for debt holders? Second, probably directly affecting higher education will be an infrastructure bill. And, whether or not they can get into that and how they get into that is going to be up to a lobbying effort. Higher ed reauthorization is out there needing to be done, but I think it's going to be lost in the tall weeds of the Senate priorities. Whether or not what I think will still be a Republican Senate, or at best 50-50 if the Democrats win both runoffs in Georgia, will they renew their investigation and oversight of online, especially for-profit institutions? Or will that have diminished as an issue as everyone has gone online? Or will there be new abuses that will be raised? And of course, the one thing we haven't mentioned is somebody's got to be nominated as secretary to replace Betsy DeVos, and there will be hearings about that and clamor, probably more internecine within the education industry as to who the deputies and assistant secretaries and general counsels will be.
Right. Right.
One point I'd make, John, I just noticed yesterday, Biden named his agency review teams. And for the Department of Education, he named 19 people.
Okay.
Not a single one is a representative of a traditional four-year institution.
What does that mean to you?
Well, what it means to me is there are three representatives on it from the American Federation of Teachers, one from the NEA, the only institution with an undergraduate program that's on there is a traditionally black university. That would be Howard. Let's see, that would be the alma mater of the new vice president.
Okay.
Scott UT Austin's law school, Norma Cantu is on it.
Okay.
But a law school. What it says is traditional higher education is not on the radar screen for the incoming Biden administration. They ought to be ashamed of themselves.
So how does higher ed get it on the radar?
To do something that they think is beneath them and that they don't want to dirty their hands doing, and it's called lobbying. It is mobilizing their boards, their faculties, their donors, their alumni, the leadership of the geographic communities where they're located, to make clear to the appropriators and to the overseers of legislation that there are urgent needs for higher education and the people they serve that need to be met. And again, that's something higher education thinks itself far too pure and too good to do with any effectiveness. Hence, they don't.
Why do you think that is? That they think they're too good or too pure for it?
Well, I don't know. Have you ever met a college president? They are above it all. And I say that with great fondness for any number of them, including a late college vice president who was my father. But they know in their heart, and they are absolutely correct, that they are serving a noble mission. They are a meritocracy. They are doing what, to the best of their ability, they have determined is the greatest good for the greatest number. And when they look at the other lobbying forces in Washington, it is, President Trump was not wrong when he called this place a swamp. Whether or not he and his administration have become creatures of it, I will leave for others to comment on. But, it's first, higher education doesn't want to engage like that. They want to be supported and funded because of the good they're doing, not because of the exercise of their political muscle.
Right.
That is a noble rationale, but one that is likely to get one not very well funded. And then they don't do their homework. I mean, for instance, John, if you ask me, how do you lobby? Choose one senator, Senator Heinrich from New Mexico. Well, I'd go to Clay County, Missouri, and recruit a former state senator by the name of Phil Snowden. Why would I do that? Because Senator Heinrich grew up in Coal Camp, Missouri, and graduated from the University of Missouri, where Senator Snowden, who led the Tigers to the 1960 Orange Bowl, is now on the board of curators. I can't imagine anybody better, including anyone from New Mexico, to walk into Senator Heinrich's office than Phil Snowden. It's that kind of homework and that kind of mobilization that too many don't do. Now, let me pay tribute to one institution, Auburn. At one point last year, I happen to know there was a retirement party for the chief of staff to Senator Shelby from Alabama, who's only chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And I looked around that room, and I saw 3 of the trustees of Auburn University had flown up here to be present at that reception.
Mhm.
That doesn't go unnoticed.
Right. Right.
What's interesting, and you mentioned a school like the University of Texas here in Austin, but it seems to be a phenomenon with big publics in conservative states. Sort of the perception is these institutions are very liberal and out of touch, and it feels like in some of the conservative states and even nationally, we see this politicians almost making higher ed kind of a caricature and a target to go after. And I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that. I mean, in Texas is pretty. I've been here now 3 years. But I came from Louisiana, and it's pretty conservative. And then I'll hear politicians say stuff that's so, anti-higher education. I'm kind of curious about that dynamic, and I see it nationally as well. I mean, even from folks that have gone to very prestigious Ivy League institutions have kind of a dim view of higher education at this point.
Well, I think it's an issue of messaging their relevance and their value. And it probably shouldn't be the institution speaking. It should be the alumni and the parents of alumni and the employers of alumni and the kids of alumni. And boy, if I were messaging for UT in Austin, I'd be talking about my individual colleges and what they do and the contribution they make in neighborhoods of big cities in Texas and in small towns in Texas. I mean, UT is, among other things, a great research institution. Well, how does that research translate into curing sick people and sick animals? Although I suspect A&M would take offense if UT even mentioned the word agriculture. It's telling that story of that we're not just supporting the fine arts and exotic, irrelevant research, or a place for kids to escape and party for 4 years. But Austin has been an island of blue in a red state for a long time. Now it's a state that is gradually becoming more purple. But Scott, I noticed despite all the claims that Democrats were going to take control of the Texas House, they did not pick up one net seat last Tuesday.
Yep.
Senator Cornyn, who the Democrats had delusion might be in trouble, only won by re-election by about 10 points. That's the world that higher ed's got to. I mean, if higher ed looks at this election, if anybody looks at it, I think they have to conclude we're still a center-right country. We talk about the difference in how people voted based on whether or not they had a college degree, and that was a huge dividing line in the electorate. But the most fundamental thing universities and their champions forget is what? Only about 36% of Americans have a college degree. That means 64% don't. And you're asking the 64% to support an institution to grant degrees to the 36%. Boy, that's an uphill climb.
I saw a statistic. I don't know. I can't remember where I saw it, but it was something along the lines of 61% of voters between 18 and 29 voted for Joe Biden. Um, what what of that, if anything, John, do you attribute to sort of a concern for social justice issues, a concern for debt relief, student debt relief, or lower tuition, um, or some of the things that um, that the Republican administration, the outgoing Republican administration, did by way of executive order to change things on a college campus, or are they just not that dialed in, the 18 to 29 set?
Well, we saw the highest voter turnout, I mean, not only nationally since 1900, but the highest among that 18 to 29 that we've ever seen in this country. Uh, John, my guess is that for them, the first issue was COVID, the refusal of the administration to take a scientific approach, the impact on their current universities or the universities they just left and still like to go back to the football games and the bars when we had games and the bars were open. Nationally, when you ask people what's the number one issue driving your vote, the exit polls, 1 in 3 said the economy, 1 in 5 racial justice, 1 in 6 COVID. If you say what's the most important issue facing America, of course, COVID rose immediately to the top.
Mm-hmm.
But my guess is that younger voter just, and I'm guessing based on a sample of 2, my kids who are currently at the University of Hartford and at Auburn. I think we're mostly bothered by an administration that did not respect science.
Okay.
And also probably unfairly penalized an administration just because they were in the manager's seat when COVID hit. They would have been unhappy with, I mean, my kids, your kids' lives have all been disrupted. They're unhappy. But let me ask my colleague Anthony to pull up a slide. Let's pull up 4, Anthony, if you would. America did vote overwhelmingly for Biden, but if you look at the vote by county in America, by geography, it is still primarily a red nation. Now, granted, some of those red dots are on spaces that have more prairie dogs than people, but boy, the blue vote in America is Northeast, California coast, Arizona, New Mexico, the deep Rio Grande Valley, although the Democrats lost some counties in the Rio Grande Valley this time, the Black Belt along the Mississippi, and a few counties in Florida where, again, Trump dramatically cut his losses in Miami-Dade County.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, this is a map very similar to one from 4 years ago, John, that I always show when I'm doing a presentation in California. Those folks just can't believe the rest of the country is that red. And I suspect it would be the same learning curve for higher education.
So what does this mean, John? Particularly with the results in the House and Senate, the current results anyway, what does this mean for some of those initiatives that people, particularly those affected by higher education, students, faculty, staff, leadership, et cetera, for some of those Biden initiatives that they expect are coming, maybe repealing Donald Trump's executive order on diversity training, again, student debt relief, Title IX, which is one that, I think is probably front and center on the minds of just about every higher ed leader in the country right now.
Well, obviously, President-elect Biden can do what he wants with executive orders, but the Senate's very quickly going to put even a break on that by saying, you do that executive order, you won't get a single judge heard, let alone confirmed. I mean, Anthony, go down to slide 6. The House of Representatives, again, you can see how red it is. the Dems were expected to gain 10, 12 seats. So far, they've lost 5, and that may go to 8, 9, or 10 net loss. The Democrats will continue to control the House, but it's going to be tougher and tougher, particularly with a deeply divided caucus and a lot of pressure from the progressives. If you go up to 5, Anthony, the Senate right now with and Anthony, we should have colored North Carolina red. Cunningham conceded to Tillis yesterday. And assuming Sullivan holds on in Alaska, the Senate is going to be 48, 48, or 48, 49. I'm sorry, the Senate is going to be 48, 50, awaiting the 2 Senate seats in Georgia. Mm-hmm. There's a special election in Georgia for 2 seats. One will be between the current Republican Senator David Perdue, challenger John Ossoff, and then a special election between the current appointed Senator Kelly Loeffler and the Democratic candidate, the Reverend Raphael Warnock, pastor of a fairly well-known church in Atlanta, Ebenezer Baptist, Daddy King's church. Mm-hmm. If the Democrats can win both of those, and Georgia hasn't elected a Democratic senator in about 20 years, I think the last was probably Sam Nunn, or Max Cleland. Then the Democrats get to a 50-50 Senate, and Vice President Harris can cast the deciding vote in ties. Mm-hmm. But you look around those other states with the yellow banners on them. As I mentioned, Democrats did not oust Cornyn in Texas. Scott, up in Kansas, the Democratic nominee out fundraised her Republican opponent 4-1, 24 million to 6 million, and still lost by almost 12 points. Senator Daines hung on in Montana by 10 points. Joni Ernst came back to win in Iowa by almost 7 points. Hyde-Smith beat Espy for the second time in Mississippi by almost 14 points. Lindsey Graham was reelected in South Carolina by 10 points, despite the fact his opponent raised $108 million. The most striking one to me, and all this speaks to the aggressiveness with which the Republicans will act in the Senate, I think, John, is Maine. Senator Collins, who some polls showed losing, won re-election by almost 9 points mm-hmm. in a state that Trump lost by almost 9 points. That's an 18-point difference.
Right.
I think you're going to have a Republican Senate that believes putting the brakes on Joe Biden is not only their job, it's their future.
So, there was no blue wave, right? The media.
There wasn't even a blue ripple. Charlie Cook, the great NBC analyst, said, I think it was yesterday, the voters may have been anti-Trump, they were not anti-Republican. And Anthony, go up to 3. Biden got, at last count, about 76 million votes to Trump's 71. But what is noticeable, Trump got about 8 million more votes this year than he got 4 years ago. Now let's assume some of his voters went on to that great voting booth in the sky and passed away, and 1 or 2 might have changed their mind. Donald Trump got about 10 million new votes this year that he didn't get 4 years ago. Fortunately, Biden got almost 11 million more votes than Senator Clinton got. But while the net outcome may have been anti-Trump, he delivered his base.
So what I'm taking away from this, and you can certainly push me back, you are the expert. I think that what I'm hearing is that Though the Biden campaign promised major, radical is probably not the right word, I guess drastic, undoing of some of Trump's policies, maybe all of them. That's unlikely to happen unless it's delivered by way of executive order. Is that a fair statement?
I think you're absolutely right. Back when the disgraced Judge Roy Moore was running against Doug Jones in Alabama in that special election a couple of years ago, I asked John, our colleague Joe Perkins down in Alabama, the truly wise man of Alabama, I said, Joe, how even in Alabama can Roy Moore get votes? And he said, Ashford, we are an outraged people, and he is the voice of rage. Trump as the voice of rage resonated, to borrow Tony Schwartz's great line about the responsive chord in politics, resonated with a lot of Americans. And I think the only drastic action, you're absolutely right, is executive order. And I think not only will the Senate put brakes on that, but I think there will be political counsel in the Biden administration that says we go too far left at our own peril.
Right.
And I don't know how to put this in words, but just like I look at Maine, for instance, in the Susan Collins election, and I think, would a generic Republican, someone not Donald Trump, fared certainly in a place like Maine, but maybe nationally better than Trump did. And the flip of that is, I'm not sure on the Democratic side, I mean, that there would have been the thing that I when I talk to folks who are sort of middle of the road on politics about Biden, it's the fact that it's just boring. I think they wanted some degree of the 4-year reality TV show to end, and just wanted someone boring. And so it was one of these things where Trump did. I do think Trump is the voice of rage and probably rallied people to the cause that may have not voted. I also think he may have been the only Republican, just kind of looking at the numbers nationally, that the Democrats in this election cycle could have beaten. On the flip, Biden may have been the perfect candidate here. I mean, just someone who, is moderate and boring and statesmanlike and all that sort of stuff.
I think you're exactly right. Without COVID and, his perceived mishandling of it, this president would have been reelected against a Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. He certainly would have been reelected, possibly even against a Pete Buttigieg or an Amy Klobuchar. We'll never know. But only COVID allowed Biden to stay in his basement, do COVID appropriate forays out, and it was all justified. John, to go back to one anomaly, you ask about the young voters. It's interesting that they voted so overwhelmingly for the oldest candidate we've ever elected president. Not a lot of difference, 3 or 4 years between him and Trump, but nonetheless, they did vote for the oldest candidate. But Scott, to your point, I would go so far as to say, with all due respect to the vice president, Biden didn't defeat Trump. Trump defeated Trump.
Yeah, no, it was kind of this thing where it's like, I'm just going to let this guy talk. Like I've been in court hearings where the opposing counsel is going on, and I'm watching the judge, and I'm just going to sit back and let this happen.
But it would have been a favor if you had shut Graff up when he was doing that.
Once Graff gets going, there's no stopping the guy, man.
Nah, man.
Where is Jill Biden a professor?
I believe University of Delaware, but I stand to be corrected on that.
Well, that's not a client of mine. Could you imagine if she had tenure and you had to be involved in the tenure revocation of that one, John, as attorney? That would be a rough one.
Well, there's no good tenure revocation fight.
Never.
But,
Never. Well, your point, John, about the agency leadership composition, the proposed agency leadership composition, it focuses, it seems, heavily on the K through 12 population. And so I think that should be a very strong indicator to higher ed, to your point earlier, that, look, you're not, the traditional four-year college, university, you're not on the radar, you're not on the administration's radar, other than for Title IX, which is unlikely to change drastically. So Rob Jones used to be senior vice president and general counsel at United Educators, and he had posted some interesting tweets this week. Scott, I think you might have commented on them too, about the fact that irrespective of how anyone feels about Title IX and the new regulation, the courts, the federal courts, have embraced the due process concept that's reflected in the new regulation. And once that happens, it's very, very hard for a politician to come in and pass a law that says you can't do this, even though the courts say it's fair. So, yeah.
I pushed back a little bit on Rob on that, and I didn't do it on Twitter because honestly, I've spent way too much time on Twitter. I mean,
you need to get off that.
Yeah, trust me, I know. In terms of how first off, I think what you said a second ago is spot on, and I'm hearing that. I have colleagues and friends who were in the previous administration, and one of the themes that I'm hearing for the next, this Biden administration at the Department of Education is more of a focus on K through 12 issues. Mm-hmm. And that includes around Title IX, and specifically that there's going to be more focus on grants for prevention programming and things like that. So I think that's good. I mean, it's also clear, that as vice president and as a candidate, Joe Biden was really clear on, hey, these new regs, no. One of the first things I'm going to do is roll these back, and it ain't going to be that easy, in part because they are regs and not a dear colleague letter, mm-hmm. right? And so there's a process you need to engage in to go through that. But I think, to Rob's point, also because there is a bevy of case law that has developed, some of which, the vast majority of which, is applying to public institutions and interpreting constitutional due process protections. Some, in California, for instance, private schools. So I as much as on the campaign trail, and you can even go, by the way, to his website, he talks about what he's going to do on Title IX, and I'm getting back to the 2011 Dear Colleague letter. Well, that's, if you're going to do that, good luck. It's going to take a couple of years. Mm-hmm. But also, I'm going to enhance Clery enforcement. There, I think, if I had to guess where we're going, that's probably where we'll end up. More robust Clery enforcement.
I think Go ahead.
Which has always been, there was a run in the Obama administration where, for the first time in the history of Title IX, you had an Office for Civil Rights that was like just opening up program compliance reviews every friggin' day, and then they put out a list of all the schools that were under investigation. Mm-hmm. We've never seen anything like that. I mean, Clery, we've had some compliance, but it's always been sort of scattershot. I mean, could you imagine if what happened in the Obama administration with Title IX program compliance reviews started happening in the Clery world? I mean, that to me, that's a possibility. The other thing I've heard is, and you heard it when Biden was giving his acceptance speech at the drive-in with all the cars, which, by the way, don't ever do an acceptance speech in like a drive-in where people are honking
their horns.
It's just not a cool look. I'll be honest with you. but he mentioned the systemic racism piece. There is a racial analog to Title IX that we don't pay any attention to. Certainly not the sort of attention that we pay to Title IX. Is it possible that under a Biden administration, that part of the kind of way to approach systemic racism, at least maybe in higher education, is to up enforcement and compliance activity around Title VI? I mean, I wouldn't be stunned by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're raising some interesting points, Scott. I think, one of the things that this is all telling me is that higher ed's unlikely to get the immediate, sort of sweeping rollback of Trump directives. And
I don't think that's true. I think there will be a rollback of the executive orders, like the diversity training.
Yeah, that's probably out. That's probably out.
Yeah.
But the issues like Title IX, admissions, diversity, that's only one portion of the pie here. When we began the discussion today, John, you mentioned stimulus funding and infrastructure funding. And I'm wondering, how does higher ed survive today, going forward, even in the midst of a pandemic that has, I think 10% of the higher ed workforce has lost their jobs. I saw that today.
And I've got to believe, John, that a lot of institutions and their lenders are in deep trouble with bonds on dormitories that don't have kids in them right now. There are a lot of issues. And John, let me correct one thing on Dr. Jill Biden. She currently teaches at Northern Virginia Community College, Nova. Delaware is where she did her PhD. And if I were thinking about where the Biden administration's head is on a number of the issues we've been talking about, I'd keep in mind that she teaches in the community college. Her PhD is from Delaware. She has 2 master's degrees from Westchester and Villanova. But most interestingly, her doctoral dissertation was entitled Student Retention at the Community College, Meeting Students' Needs.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'd know that if I went into advocate with I won't use such a tawdry word as lobby, with the Department of Education.
So interesting. We're talking about a pandemic. We're talking about underserved segments of the population. We're talking about debt, student loan issues, tuition cost issues. I get a communications report every day that summarizes a bunch of media around higher ed issues. And I'm just looking at some of the headlines here. University admissions tests under scrutiny amid pandemic. College applications decrease amid pandemic. California state schools see increase in enrollment amid pandemic. Syracuse, Albany, they go remote. Colleges see dropping off in dining services. To your point, John, about the dorms, dining services revenue amid COVID-19 pandemic. Colleges prepare to send students home for Thanksgiving amid pandemic. These all have a common denominator, and the common denominator is money. The schools are not making what they made. That fact is reflected in the 10% furlough rate in the higher ed workforce that I just mentioned. So, John, if I'm a president or a member of a board of trustees for a school, particularly some of the smaller, maybe less well-capitalized schools, in the Midwest, the South, the Northwest, et cetera, and I'm asking you to come in, John Ashford, and your folks at Hawthorn, and tell me what I need to be doing right now with respect to the next 6 months, with respect to the political change, the administration change, and some of these bills that may be pending or may be resolved. Tell me what to do as a leader.
Well, identifying the opportunities and the timeline, I'm afraid by the time a stimulus package is seriously debated and settled, or an infrastructure bill, higher education won't have figured out that there was an opportunity there for them or how to maximize that opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I think mobilizing the great higher education association, they'll do in their ponderous way what they otherwise will or wouldn't have done. I think the best opportunity is for 3, 4, 5 fairly nimble-footed universities to come together, get either foundation or corporate or individual donors to fund an initiative and put a task force together to make sure higher education's constituents' needs are served. Their students, their employees, their communities, their alumni. It's got to be somebody who is willing to take the initiative and able to find some modest funding to mobilize these things. I mean, John, something that would not cost much, but higher education, to my knowledge, has never done. The database of donors to federal campaigns and the most state campaigns is public information. Run it against their alumni and donor list and find out who of their donors are major donors to public officials. Gee, then you know who to call and ask to send a letter or make a phone call or a visit on your behalf. That doesn't cost much to do, but somebody's got to think about it and do it.
This conjures up a phrase in my mind, or inspires a recollection of a phrase I saw in your bio: grassroots. This sounds like a grassroots mobilization effort.
Absolutely. Senator Shelby would pay appropriate attention to the national organizations of higher education. He would pay some attention to Dr. Googe, the president of Auburn, and to the president of the University of Alabama. But who he's really going to pay attention to are people like Jimmy Rain and Charles McCrary and Jimmy Sanford, all members of the board at Auburn, one running the largest treated wood company in America that's based in the little town of Abbeville, Alabama, one the retired CEO of Alabama Power, one the chairman of the largest cotton co-op in the Southeast. Those are the people he cares about.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's who he wants to hear from.
Right. And that's not what's happening with respect to higher ed. I'm sorry, Scott, I keep cutting you off.
No. Yeah, when I think of lobbying, I typically think of, it's one of two things. We're looking for something, regulatory relief, which typically comes in Republican administrations, and we went completely the opposite direction under this administration. That's one thing. I mean, for the last 40 years now, we've just added more and more regulations, and there's been for higher education institutions, and it's why so many lawyers now play prominent roles within those institutions. And there's no party. I remember listening to the vice president debate and Pence talking about, we're rolling back regulations, and I said, not in higher education. I mean, that's certainly not true. So there seems to be no party that's interested in having a conversation, either Republican or Democrat, about rolling back regulations in higher education. And then the big piece is, we need something for all the economic reasons you mentioned. We need something in the way of stimulus funds that aren't repayable, that, grants or whatever the case may be. And I love, I haven't seen any organized efforts, at least at this point, along the lines that we were just talking about to get those sorts of funds. So it'll be interesting.
So assuming that higher ed's not going to mobilize in a concerted effort, John, for the schools, it doesn't matter what the school is. Say I'm the president or I'm a chair of a board, and I just want to look out for my school. Is there still some value in my having a very keen understanding of how what's happening in the federal political landscape impacts downstream my school's interests. And
absolutely, you are informed about and hopefully influencing that process, or you're the ignorant victim of it. I mean, look at what the National Institutes of Health spend on research grants to, the major universities, particularly those with medical centers. Look at the consequences of whether you provide tuition funding to community colleges for the first 2 years of college, to families making less than $125,000 for any institution. And how can you do that without providing debt relief to the currently owed student debt? To understand those things, Nita Lowey is retiring as chair of the House Committee on Appropriation. There's a right active battle for who's going to succeed her. Who's going to win that fight? And what's their view of higher education? I mean, that has real consequences. I mean, I think of my own experience, having gone to a very small private college out on the Great Plains of Missouri and to one of the Ivy Leagues for graduate school. Both are enormously impacted. Probably that small college, remoter, less well-informed, or remote, less well-informed. My English professor would like me to remember that. Less well-informed, less able to impact Washington, perhaps. But, they're, whether it is relief, as Scott said, is stimulus relief of grants that don't have to be repaid, is forgiveness of institutional as well as student debt, hugely important to these schools.
You're talking about something, and I don't see a lot of it. I think it happens at some of the bigger schools that have more robust government affairs units. But you're talking about being able to sort of not predict, but estimate where things might be going and how they may affect your school by understanding who the players are that are moving in and out of positions. And to your example earlier, the Texas to Missouri connection, what the backgrounds of those people are, the importance of studying the players and the landscape way, way, way deeper than the superficial level that's presented in the headlines. That's what I'm taking from this.
I was doing work, and I'm not revealing the confidence here. I was doing some work for the University of Missouri when Claire McCaskill was elected to the U.S. Senate. And I said, she grew up in Columbia. She went to the University of Missouri. What sorority was she in? Who was her roommate? Mm-hmm. Who was her major advisor? I mean, who are people who have a personal relationship with her? Who's Dr. Jill Biden's star student over the years? Right. Who is, it's a very, the late Scott from your state of Texas, the late Lloyd Benson once said, I know the difference between AstroTurf and real grass. It's finding the people with those real relationships that can make a difference.
I think I'm going to shoehorn that comment in many conversations today. I have a call in about 5 minutes, and I'm going to use that repeatedly, I think. John, you also need to know who's their favorite band. I think that's important. I can see Claire McCaskill as sort of a Def Leppard fan. It's just kind of my
Leonard Skinner.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, when somebody went in to talk to Senator McCaskill about regulation, they'd have been smart to know her father was the state insurance commissioner in Missouri. She grew up in a regulator's household.
Right.
You got to know the things.
So, since unfortunately, man, I wish we could keep this conversation going all day. John, you've been in the public affairs, public relations, politics game for a very long time now. As you look to the 10 years ahead, what are the immediate next political and communication steps the higher ed industry needs to take or should start thinking about to get ready for the challenges that are going to unfold over time? You know, we keep saying with respect to the pandemic, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can say that with any industry right now. In terms of politics and communications, what do schools need to start doing today to start getting ready to survive over the next several years?
They need to figure out what threats and what opportunities the federal government and to an extent their state governments offer. They need to understand that, and I transparently let me note I'm on the board of an online for-profit university. They need to understand that everyone is in the online business now. They need to understand that billions of dollars will be invested in stimulus, in infrastructure, in various forms of relief. And if they don't get it, someone else will. And then frankly, their social science department would make a great contribution to the political process if they can figure out what went wrong with polling this year and how to fix it, John.
John, any closing thoughts before we wrap it up here?
No, but I can tell you that there's no group of clients we more enjoy serving or take greater pride in than the higher education clients, and are deeply grateful for the opportunity to work with you.
Well, I'll tell you, having worked closely alongside you, as I said in the beginning, having been mentored by you, I can say with all confidence that the higher ed industry is well served by you and your colleagues, Larry Walsh, some others at Hawthorn Group. I've learned a ton from you, and what I have, quite frankly, you know, some of the stuff that I've learned from you guys over the years has helped to save my clients money because we are thinking about things way in advance. You know, how the PR, how the optics, how the politics impact the game. And so, you know, again, I am a firsthand advocate for Hawthorn Group and the types of resources you all bring to bear. And I thank you for your contribution to my own growth over the years very much.
Well, I want to thank you as well, because I've seen John's growth, and he was a real amateur before you all got a hold of him, and so I appreciate you as well.
Be careful, Scott. He's likely to unleash Demetrius McDaniel from up the street at Greenberg there in Austin on you.
But I want to make plain that I fear no man.
You know what, man? Fear won't help you. Being on your toes, you won't even see me coming. That's the dark arts at work there. So, again, many thanks, John Ashford, and to all the good folks at the Hawthorn Group for the time and insight that went into talking with us today. We've all learned a lot for sure. Many thanks to my partners at Hirsch, Weinstein in Boston for making this podcast available to all. It's always been our goal to get free education out there to the higher ed industry. A humble thanks to our marketing and communications director, Aaron Larson, without whom none of this would be possible. And as always, I'm grateful to my very good friend and wingman, Scott Schneider, for his ongoing contributions to the Higher Ground podcast and to my musical interests. So thank you very much, Scott. I am John Graff. This is Higher Ground, and that is a wrap.